What's the point of using watercolor pencils and water-soluble pencils when you can just use watercolor? That's the question I get asked the most, and I'm going to show you how special these pencils are, the benefits of using them, and how they can change how you watercolor paint for the better. Over the past year and a half, I've developed a bunch of watercolor pencil and water-soluble pencil techniques simply because I've been using them a lot and I've learned them in depth. I went from not knowing what to do with these unattractive pencil lines to learning that each problem has a solution and that I could paint absolutely anything with them in any style and even add beautiful effects to the painting that only these pencils can create. So today, to make my point, I'll be doing a demo with a new set of INKTENSE by Derwent. These are ink-based, which makes them more vibrant than watercolor pencils. With all the practice I've had, I found that they're just very similar to the watercolor kind and I use them in the same way. So the information in this video goes for watercolor pencils and water-soluble pencils, like INKTENSE pencils. We know that these pencils are easy to carry around and that they're great for sketching, but what else? And I think that the main reason why I get asked so often, what's the point of using these pencils, is because I tend to start my paintings with a technique that resembles watercolor painting. I mean that I use a palette with a rough texture, and watercolor paper could work too here, by the way, and I create color swatches on the palette with the pencils directly, and with a paintbrush, I turn that into paint that can be used like watercolor paint from pans or tubes. Because from there, we forget about the pencil and we just apply the paint with a paintbrush. I really enjoy this technique because I'm able to paint quick and smooth base layers for all my artworks, even though these are pencils. We could just use these pencils or regular colored pencils and color, and I love to do that on a coloring page with small sections to fill out, or on a basic painting with no background like this apple from one of my Skillshare classes. But on landscapes or portraits, imagine that it would take forever to do, and we'd end up with a bunch of visible pencil lines on something like a sky or skin, even after activating the pigment with water. And that can be a problem depending on your style. So for a base layer on such paintings, I want something that is quick, smooth, and that looks flawless. And I am glad I'm able to get that from these pencils. So that's a huge benefit. They're a versatile tool. You can use them as regular colored pencils or you can use them as watercolor, hence the name. Another benefit of using these pencils like watercolor is that you'll be able to have more control over the level of transparency, which isn't the case when coloring, because so much more pigment gets deposited on paper. And that's why I painted the background trees directly with my brush. I was able to make them look very light, while if I had colored with a pencil directly on paper, they would have looked less discreet, a bit heavier in a way. And it gets even more interesting after the initial stage in the painting, at least in the way that I use these pencils. For example here, there were a bunch of details in this project, and since I moved from painting the background to painting the middle ground to finishing with the foreground, I had a lot of little things to add and worry about. In the middle ground, there were many trees to paint, and even what looked like a complicated stream of water with many rocks and things going on. And for anyone getting started with watercolors or even advanced beginners, this will be scary and challenging to paint. Most times, you don't even know where to start unless you have a lot of practice under your belt. With pencils, I find it comes a bit easier, maybe because most of us have started with coloring back in childhood. And having the possibility to see a painting come alive as a coloring first makes the process feel more reassuring, I find. And I'd really love to know your thoughts about this point in the comments below, because whether you paint with watercolor or watercolor pencils, I'm pretty sure you can feel what I mean right now. That's why for watercolor beginners who want to tackle more complex scenes, I think watercolor pencils or water-soluble pencils are going to be a great fit, and it might be a good idea to start with shapes, like the apple I showed you earlier, or these Hobbiton icons, another one of my Skillshare classes that I will link in the description of the video as well. With coloring, it's also a bit easier to mix colors because all you have to do is to add them on paper, like in a regular coloring. And then the water will do the rest once we activate the pigment. And that's why here, I overlapped colors a lot. It's always going to give a painting a more authentic look than if we are just to draw the chunks with brown and the rocks with gray, for instance. With watercolor painting, you need more pre-planning for those things because the paint is wet always, and that means it dries too. So we need to develop a skill to have that vision ahead of time of where we're going to paint this or that and which colors we're going to use. I find it's easier to be a bit more daring while working on dry paper like this as well. This water stream would have been technical to paint with watercolors, I find. I might even have needed to use several layers and techniques in my realistic style. But with the pencils, all the details, colors, nuances are right there already with just coloring. And a huge plus for me with these pencils is how easy it is to activate the paint when you know how to do it right. Because you don't even need a lot of water to do it. And if you know watercolor painting, you know how much water can mess everything up for you in seconds, whether it is you didn't add enough water or you added too much water, etc. And don't even get me started on the hassle and stress that that can cause, even though I love traditional watercolor and always will, probably even more than these pencils, just because I am very comfortable painting complex projects nowadays. But it wasn't always that way. Water-soluble and watercolor pencils make the process so much more straightforward with the blending, and now I think that you can see already how these pencils could change the way you paint completely on an emotional level, especially for a beginner, because of less brush, more freedom, more peace, with a coloring technique at least. Also, on such specific elements like the trees, the few visible pencil lines don't disturb the realism in the painting. If anything, they add a slightly different touch to it compared to traditional watercolors. I'm going to show you more techniques that make these pencils even better than they might seem on the visual level this time. But first, if you want to learn how to use them easily, I have a few beginner Skillshare classes I mentioned earlier, but also a wide choice of intermediate paintings with a variety of different subjects, including this forest painting, explained in detail and in real time on my Patreon, and I'll link that in the description as well. There's more to these pencils than just using them as watercolor or as colored pencils, and that's why there are neither of those. So I'm going to show you where their power truly lies with the last layers in my forest painting. Adding the first trees was easy, and we can tell the ones at the far back from the ones in the middle, thanks to using water first, and then using the coloring technique. But then, how do you keep building more depth with the trees that are located in the front? A huge advantage for these pencils, besides what we learned before, the fact that they make it easy to place elements and details on paper, to mix colors, and to turn to paint, is that you can make a subject pop like the trees at the front by using more fun techniques. And the first one is to play with adding more layers, more pressure, and darker colors to those trees. I like to do this little by little. So first, I added those trees in the same manner as the ones before. Same colors, same techniques. And you can see that they don't stand out so much yet. And that is why I decided to add foliage before taking it to the next level. I did that with my palette swatches technique in the same way we would in traditional watercolor painting. With such a nice base for these elements in the foreground, I started adding a lot more pressure, and I incorporated a dark gray color to make the trees and rocks pop against the rest of the painting. I also added some detail on the trunks. Adding darker colors and more detail to the foreground of any painting is a foundational art technique to create a sense of depth where we can clearly distinguish what is right there in front of us from what's farther away. It's still important to add some color at this stage, however. You wouldn't want to end up with really dark elements in front. We need to keep that color harmony going throughout. Highlights are really important too, and with watercolor and water-soluble pencils, you can add to a painting without necessarily blending the pigment. And that's what I did here by adding dry white highlights. I kept those for the middle ground elements because since they're not as close to us as the front ones, they're supposed to be more subtle. But as you can see, they still make a difference on the looks of these trees. You can even do that with any color of choice. Considering that these INKTENSE pencils I was using there, they are so vibrant that it's easy to add a light color like yellow on top of a dark blue and have it show a bit still. Wetting the lead of your pencils is another powerful way to add to a painting. It's not just the bright touches of color that those melted chunks of pigment add, it's also the texture, something you could create with oil pastels, for instance. With watercolor, it's also possible to achieve a similar effect when you take pigment directly from a tube, otherwise it will be much harder and complicated to do from pans. So it's great to see what can be done with watercolor and water-soluble pencils, but it's not going to help much if you don't know how to blend the pencils with water after coloring, because a painting will turn muddy very quickly with the wrong technique. That's why I encourage you to watch this next or check out my entire watercolor pencil and INKTENSE playlist. And if you enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments. It means a lot to me to hear back from you. And sometimes I even get to learn from your own experiences and feedback. So thank you so much for watching and see you next time.